Hello, I'm Tom Carmichael, Chair of Neurology at UCLA, and this is Dr. Adys Mendizabal.
Hi, everyone.
She's an assistant professor of neurology at UCLA, and today we're here to talk about healthcare disparities, healthcare outcomes, access to care, and overall health in communities that have traditionally not received the same kind of healthcare across the U.S. So one way to think about this is to think about one particular disease and the leading edge research that goes on in that area. And that's why we're pleased to have Dr. Mendizabal today. Dr. Mendizabal, why don't you introduce yourself rather than me introducing you, and tell us about your research and how you hit some of these areas.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Tom. So I am a movement disorder specialist, and I specialize in a rare condition called Huntington's disease. And then from a research standpoint, I do health services research, which focuses on questions related to access, outcomes, and quality of care for all patients, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background. So my research is particularly interested in trying to understand how many patients with how many patients who are Latino, Black, or from other minoritized groups are affected by this rare condition, Huntington's disease. And then also taking it a step further in trying to understand what are some disparities that these communities may have, and then how can we improve access for all groups to specialty care that takes place at centers of excellence, such as the one here at UCLA, but then also more broadly, improving access for these communities for general neurological care.
So Huntington's disease is an unusual degenerative disease in the brain. It's characterized by abnormal movements and slowly decreasing cognition and some psychiatric manifestation. And the research and the conception of the disease has typically been among Caucasians. Mm-hmm. And yet, of course, it's not restricted to Caucasians. And so you jump into this and now look into healthcare access, overall care, disease differences. There may be interesting and important genetic differences. And tell us a little bit about the questions you're asking and how you're answering them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really, really good point. For Huntington's disease in particular, there's a little bit of an historical interest in why is it that I'm looking into Latinos in particular with the disease, which is that everything we know about Huntington's, the gene discovery and the mutation, was actually a cohort in Venezuela. And yet, as you mentioned, most of what we know about when we think of Huntington's, the way that it's studied or described is typically in predominantly white, non-Hispanic cohorts. And I think many forget that, again, the gene discovery that happened now 30 years ago was actually thanks to a study of this cohort, Latino cohort in Venezuela. So in terms of how is it that I'm studying, or what are some of the research questions, one of the first things that I've kind of focused on is on understanding our cohort here at UCLA. So UCLA has seen over the years close to 400 patients with Huntington's disease, making us a pretty large center, one of the largest ones in the country. And within that number of patients, because of being in LA County, actually 20% of our patients are Latino. And then when you do a comparison of what is the general demographics when we think of most HD studies, and not only in Huntington's, but general neurological studies, we often see that 90% of participants in a clinical trial may be white, non-Hispanic, but then there's a mismatch between the demographics of that clinical trial and then what we actually see in the clinic. So then starting with looking at our center, some of the things that we're focused on is trying to understand differences in terms of outcomes. So whether it is disability, level of disability amongst Latino and other groups that we see here in our center. Also looking at questions through surveys of what was the quality of care that patients had at the time that they got a diagnosis.
We know that though there's been some really amazing clinical trial work in Huntington's disease, there isn't a treatment.
Correct.
So we're not really looking at treatment and outcomes from that, but we are looking at access to the consideration for that advanced level care.
Correct.
And so you look at that through your own patients, UCLA local center patients, and then these national databases.
Correct.
And what kinds of things are you finding, and how might that move the needle in this disease, and how can we think of it in moving the needle in neurology in general?
If we look at the large data sets for Huntington's only, for example, and we see that 90% of the participants are white non-Hispanic, Then we compare that to either all hospitalizations for Huntington's disease and what are the demographics of patients with Huntington's that are not in a research study, and then the demographics within our center. And we see that there's a big mismatch. So just last week, we presented at AAN a poster that was looking at all hospitalizations for Huntington's in the state of California. And we see that in California, there's about 22% of hospitalizations for Huntington's that are by Latino patients. So when you see that mismatch from the clinical research study, that is what's currently being used to develop new disease staging, clinical trial designs, and even recruit patients for clinical trials for Huntington's, and then you compare it to patients that are not in the research study, that just went to the hospital for whatever it is, and you see this mismatch, and that tells you that there's a large number of patients from historically minoritized groups that are not part of research. So then the question is, why are they not in that research study that we're using to identify patients for a clinical trial? So then that raises the question of, is it an issue of they're not accessing the centers where the studies happen? Is it that there are communities that may not be interested in being part of research? Is it that they're not being approached to be part of research? And those are some of the questions that we're trying to answer. When we take it one step further, right, of let's say we develop a cure for Huntington's disease, but we're developing a cure based on data that is not representative of all patients, and not just based on racial and ethnic diversity. It could also be just socioeconomic diversity, right? If we create a cure that is not representative of all groups, then we don't know if those treatments, if they get approved, if they would actually be effective in all groups.
Are there ways that are practical that we can put into our care patterns now that might help patients who are Black or Hispanic, Latino, and experience Huntington's disease, or really any neurologic condition? Can we engage and help healthcare now?
Yeah, very good point. I think part of it is just raising awareness. So starting with having these discussions of how these communities are affected by neurodegenerative conditions. I don't think there's a single solution. I think it's going to require multiple solutions on multiple levels. I think about it at individual level, then I think of providers, whether it is primary care physicians, local neurologists, or us as subspecialists. And then I think healthcare system and then policy level. And then we probably need solutions at all of those steps in order to ensure that everyone has access to the diagnosis and specialty care and also participation in clinical research, right? So education at the level of the HD specialist. So things like cultural sensitivity training, how to approach different communities to have them participate in clinical research. Different things to consider when it comes to communication and best practices with certain groups that have been historically marginalized in medicine. So that's one aspect, the education piece at the HD provider, Huntington's disease provider level. But then there's also the education that may take place at the primary care physician level or local neurologist. We do see patients, for example, that will say, well, Huntington's disease doesn't have a cure, so my neurologist said, what is the point of you going elsewhere, right? And although that is true, we don't have a cure. We do think that seeing subspecialists that have expertise in the disease, going to centers where the research is happening, does have the opportunity to actually be able to identify a cure faster, right? But when it comes to health system and policy, we know that health insurance is one big aspect of how is it that patients come into contact with healthcare systems and different clinics. And in the case of Huntington's disease, unlike some other similar conditions like ALS, for example, patients with Huntington's are not automatically eligible for something like Medicare. So those are some areas from a policy standpoint in which us as neurologists partnering with patient organizations and then some of the larger neurology organizations, we could try to push forward legislation that can improve access to health insurance for this patient group, but then other similar conditions, similar neurodegenerative conditions.
It's been a really great conversation, and it's given us a lens to look at this one disease and understand in a very focused way how we can improve underserved communities in their traditional lack of healthcare access, treatments, and good outcomes. And it's allowed us to say, if this is the process for Huntington's disease, then we can take it and apply it to many others.
Correct.
So it's been very interesting to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the goal with a lot of our work, is sharing how is it that we approach this issues related to access and outcomes for all groups, knowing that if groups that have the greatest challenge in accessing care or having the best outcomes, if those groups do better, everyone else does better, right? And by sharing some of what we do, the idea is that hopefully other neurologists, investigators, researchers can use similar tools or a similar approach in their own diseases, with a goal of, pretty much trying to improve neurological care and brain health for all. So.
Great. Well, thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Yes. And that concludes this edition. Thank you for your attention.